Hi, I'm Michael Wilde, and this is a video on creating tiled textures inside of Photoshop. So what I've got here is a picture of my desk that I'm sat in front of. I just took a photo of it because it's got some nice wood detailing, and I'm going to make that into a tiled texture for use inside of Mari or any other program. So what I'm doing here is I've just opened up the image inside of Photoshop, I've graded it slightly so it's a bit less dull than it was, and I'm just creating a new 2K document. So this is all pre-recorded, so I'm just going to talk over what I've done. I'll slow it down and speed it up as we go along. Because it's a 2K document, then I've got a lot of extra space to work with. My camera takes photos high resolution, so I've just scaled it down and picking a section that I want to work with. Because the grain on this desk is quite different, I need to pick sections that are quite similar so that my tile texture doesn't stand out. That's one thing that you will learn quite quickly when you're making tile textures, is you need the detail to be quite uniform so that nothing is overly jarring. So here I've just duplicated the image. I've kind of found an area that I quite like. All the grain is going in a fairly similar direction. But at the top I've got this section that's fairly grey and desaturated. So what I've done is I've just created a mask. I've feathered that off. And now I'm just playing around with changing the saturation to see if I can fix that. So I've brought the lightness up a bit just so it's not quite as dark as it was. And I'm just changing, I've got two layers of the same image, one behind another, and I'm just trying to get those to match a little bit better. So I'm merging this down now because I'm getting ready to use the offset feature. So the offset feature is one of the most important things that you use when it comes to tiling textures. So here you can see it, it's under Filter, Other, Offset. I haven't cropped my image, so I've still got a lot of extra data around the canvas, as you can see here. So I've just transformed that, cropped that down, and I've used the offset again. So what I've done quickly is I've undone that offset first though, and I am darkening the left-hand side of the image. I'm creating a new adjustment layer, a levels, and I'm changing the mask on that just to change this left-hand side of the image so that when it does offset, it matches slightly better because it was a little bit too light. So I'm just playing around with those values, getting something that I feel is a bit more uniform across the whole image. I'm using the paintbrush tool with the mask that the adjustment layer has made to tell it where I want that adjustment to happen, and just setting the opacity down a little bit so that everything kind of better matches up. So I've merged down the layers. It's important to merge layers when you offset, just so that everything moves at once, and then I've applied that offset filter again. So what the offset does is it offsets your whole image across the canvas, and you can basically see your seams on your image. So now you can see what I've got here is I've got this offsetted texture with this one seam down the middle and one seam kind of horizontally. So what I'm using is I'm using the clone stamp tool. Pick the clone stamp tool, and the clone stamp tool is another super important feature you're going to be using when it comes to creating tiled textures, potentially the thing that you use the most. So if you press Alt when using the clone stamp tool, what you get is the ability to sample a place, and then where you move the cursor to and paint will pick those pixels and paint them across. So it's a way to clone details over, and you can use this for kind of covering areas up or fixing seams or removing details or adding details in other areas of your texture. And it's such a handy one because it's just great for getting rid of this offset seam. There's other ways to get rid of it. I could have used the patch tool. I could have done some other things, maybe copying bits across using selection and copying and pasting. But I find the clone stamp tool is the easiest one to work with. So what I'm doing here is I'm just working on one layer. The clone stamp tool can sample from other layers. So for the sake of a non-destructive workflow, I probably should have created another layer and painted on that. But I was being quick and lazy. So here I'm just picking areas that I think work. I'm making sure that I get the veins of the wood kind of lining up, making sure that grain comes across. You can see on the left and the right there is a difference between the grain. So the right has got some darker bits and the left is slightly more saturated without as quite dark values. So I just want to make sure those match up and make sure that at that seam I'm not getting any noticeable lines and weird bits, basically. So it's important when using the clone stamp tool to set the hardness of the brush to something fairly high. Otherwise you'll get a very smooth and feathered edge, and that will give you soft textures. And it's important to avoid that, especially if you're using this tile texture a lot, then it can be picked out quite easily. So I recommend using a hardness that isn't 0 in Photoshop. It can make it more difficult, and often it means you have to go in and be a bit more pixel perfect, but it will give you a much better texture. So one good thing about the clone stamp tool is that once you've sampled an area and you hover your mouse over where you're about to paint, it tells you the information that you're going to paint with. So you can use that easily to line up the veins, which is what I'm doing here, just to make sure that the grain of the wood does line up and I don't get any weird jankiness from that. So now I'm going in and I'm getting rid of any dark spots, as you can see here. Those are things that will stand out, especially, say, for example, especially if you were to tile this texture multiple times, like a tiling ratio of 5, 10, 20, then those dots that you just see one or two of will be shown 20, 30 times over across the whole texture, and it will be really easy to pick out where the tiling textures start and ends. And that's the real thing that we're trying to avoid here, is making sure that we don't see that it's a tiling texture. I felt that the color value between this transition was a bit too harsh from saturated to non-saturated, so I'm just bringing some of that detail down to get a slightly nicer transition. Now I'm starting to cover up some of these darker veins. I don't want them to stand out in the texture, so I'm just going to cover them up with some of the grain from other parts of the image. So I'm just going to offset this again, send it back the reverse of what I originally did it, so I get my original one, and then just have a look at it from a different angle, see if there's any bits that need cleanup. Now that I've done it from one angle, that will often happen is when you reverse back to the original, you will see some spots that you missed or that because of the clone stamp have changed and need it again. So I'm just zooming in and out to see how the image looks as kind of a thumbnail. It's really important to do that because if you're tiling something a lot of times, any details that stand out when you are far away will be really obvious. So I've seen that there's this almost desaturated line in the image. I'm just feathering a selection there. I'm going to paint a similar color on top, and then using the blend modes in Photoshop, I will add that on top to try and get rid of this desaturation. So I'm just trying the different blend modes, seeing what's worked for me. I want something that adds a bit of color but doesn't change the value overly. So if I play with the blend mode and the opacity of that, then I should get something that works quite nicely. This is a bit too desaturated, so I'm just going to try playing with a bit more saturation in the paint that I put on that layer. Feathering the selection again. So I find that multiply, overlay, and add or linear dodge are often the blend modes I use the most. They're really useful ones and quite versatile, especially when it comes to creating tile textures. They can help you get rid of any bits that sort of stand out. So I'm just going back into the thumbnail sort of view, zooming out and just seeing what those adjustment layers do. So I'm quite happy with that. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to save it out as a TIFF and test that inside of Mari just to see how this works as a tiling texture. So I'm inside of Mari now, and I'm just going to drop that into my node graph, and it will automatically make a tile node from that. So if I view that now, I can see how this is looking for my first kind of iteration of this. So if I change the tile ratio, I can see that while it's fairly working, I don't see any immediate seams. I've got this darker, slightly desaturated splodge on it, so I want to get rid of that next. So I'm zooming out again, just checking it as a thumbnail and seeing which bit of the image needs work. So I'm going to add a new layer quickly, and I'm going to paint that same color I was using earlier over everything and just set it to a really low opacity blend mode, just to help unify the entire image, because I felt it was a little bit desaturated when I tried it. So if I apply this to everywhere, then that should help bring it all together a little bit. So I'm using another levels node. I've got this slightly darker area in the left-hand side. So I'm just going to, using a levels adjustment, I can help lighten that area slightly. So I'm going to try saving that out again, see how that works for me. So that looks a lot better, but I've got a slight seam where I had that adjustment node in the corner because it hasn't overlapped. So I need to undo that and maybe offset the image so that that section is in the center this time when I do that adjustment. That way I won't get the line from that adjustment layer. So I'm finding it's a bit desaturated in places, so I'm adding a bit more color again. and I'm making sure now that mask doesn't go around the edge at all, so that when I offset it, I don't get any lines from it. So again, I've got some areas that don't have quite the same color, so I'm just going to fill that in. Changing the blend mode, trying to get something that matches. That didn't really work, so I'm going to try a level, see if that works for me. If I zoom out, I'm still seeing this sort of desaturated strip in the center, so that's something that I want to get rid of because that's going to show when I tile it. Offset it again to see how it's looking. Still got this dark patch, so what I'm going to try now is I'm going to duplicate the layer and I'm going to try an adjustment called shadows and highlights. This is a really good one for grading photographic reference or anything like that, just to help unify it a bit and to get rid of any really harsh highlights or really harsh shadows. So I've duplicated the layer, I'm going to apply that, I'm going to mess around with some of the options that it gives me. The problem with this is it can really flatten your textures, and I find sometimes it can make them look a little bit crunchy as well. So this is why I resisted from using it from the beginning, but it's definitely something to play with, and if you find that it gives you a good result, then go for it. So after playing a little bit with the sliders, while I quite like this result, I don't think it's perfect. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set the opacity down and overlay it slightly on top of the one that I had before, and that way I don't use it completely, but I get some of that unification that the shadows and highlights adjustment has added. If I bring that into Mari again and update that, I'm not loving it because I'm getting these sort of splotches. So one final thing that I'm going to try is I'm going to take this layer, I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to desaturate it because I think the values are fine now, but I think the color isn't quite matching up. And now I'm going to add another color layer on top. Apply that as a blend mode overlay, bringing that color down slightly because it's a bit too orange, make it something a bit more natural. And now if I merge them and then bring down the opacity of that layer, I can see that that's really helped with the almost blotchiness that the colors had before. So I'm going to try this final version, see how that looks. Making a tile texture often takes a lot of tweaks and a lot of iterations of it. It's really important to know how to do this though, especially in work. If I'm given a, say for example, character's costume and I need to make a fabric to exactly match for a digi-double or something like that, then I can't go online and just get a tile texture from a website. I need it to look exactly like this character's costume. So I can find a sample or a photographic reference from on set, use that and then create a tile texture from that. So cool. It's not perfect by any means. I've got that slightly dark area that you can see a little bit. If I change the tiling value of it a little bit less, then it kind of goes away. But if I wanted to use this more over an image, then I would probably have to go in and further refine it. But for an image that I've made in about 20-30 minutes, I think it's pretty good. So tile textures are never going to be perfect. You're never going to be able to use them as a replacement for texturing, but they give you a really great base. If you've got any questions, please leave them below and feel free to subscribe. I've got some more videos coming out, or head over to my website, michaelwilde.co.uk for more information about me. Best of luck texturing and have a great day. Cheers.